Time to move. Greetings and welcome to this panel on culture, the culture of security, cyberspace, and underground battlefields. My name is Ted Magder. I'm a professor of media culture and communication at New York University, and I'm joined to my right by Rita King, who's the CEO and creative director of Dancing Inc. Productions, and far right, Joshua Fouts, chief global strategist, Senior Fellow of Digital Media and Public Policy at the Center for the Study of the Presidency. Both Rita and Josh are also Senior Fellows at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. And given the title of today's panel, I'd like to start with a bit of a caveat. When the three of us met for the very first time, as it turns out, last week in New York, and we began to compare notes on what we know and what we think we know and what we're pretty sure we don't know almost at all, we came to the conclusion rather quickly that none of us is a cybersecurity expert. If by the term cybersecurity we mean a person who's responsible for monitoring digital environments with the objective of identifying and counteracting real or perceived threats to the public order, to public morals, or the safety of the state. And hopefully, I hasten to add, this is a person who does this kind of work in a manner that's legally accountable in some reasonably transparent way. And we further decided, the three of us, that though it might be fun, neither of us would, or none of us would play that person as a role on the panel today. So instead, what we're going to do is really allow Rita and Josh to focus the panel and their presentation on a remarkable project that they've undertaken together, Understanding Islam Through Virtual Worlds. And my hope is that as we are introduced to this project, we will have the opportunity to enter into a conversation, one that presumably will take place not only in the next hour, but over the next day or so. A conversation on the protocols and the rules that might constitute something that could be called digital diplomacy. And our fear is that, as might be reflected in the title of the panel, this conversation about cyberspace is often overdetermined by, well, fear, by anxiety. We aren't naive enough to think that these are spaces of bliss or perfect human concourse, but we aren't moved by the proposition that they represent some new kind of permanent Wild West. And before I hand over the panel to Josh and Rita, I just want to make a few more introductory remarks of a more historical nature. I'm a scholar of media, primarily a scholar of international law and media, but I know a little bit about the history of media systems and the history of the various networks that we've created for long-distance interpersonal human communication. And in this sense, the past is something of a prologue to the conversation we're going to have today. In 1830 or so, when Samuel Morse stood before the U.S. Congress to ask for funds to create an electric telegraph system for the United States, he said, "The telegraph can make one neighborhood of the whole country," adding, "The greater the speed with which intelligence can be transmitted from point to point, the greater is the benefit derived to the whole community." You can search the historical record for literally thousands of statements of this kind, and if you don't want to go back into the historical record of the 1830s, you can go back to 1990 and find many similar quotes about the internet, and Al Gore probably made some of them. Well, 15 years after Samuel Morse made those remarks to the U.S. Congress, things like false news reports, stock swindlers, con artists online in the 19th century led some people to label Morse's fabulous invention the tell-lie graph. The telegraph was expensive to use. People began to send most of their telegraph messages in code, by which I mean they were ciphered. And by 1875, the international community, primarily Europe and the United States, had signed an international legal agreement, the International Telegraph Act of 1875, which included regulations designed to protect, and now I'm quoting language from 1875 International Convention, public order, public morals and the safety of the state. When radio became a broadcast technology in the 1920s, very quickly there were similar concerns about propaganda, specifically in this case propaganda managed, devised, mounted by states, including, as it turns out, the Vatican, which operated the very first shortwave international radio service. And this led to a conversation in the League of Nations, ill-fated as it turns out for many reasons, on a convention on the use of broadcasting in the cause of peace, a convention whose final version was drafted in 1936, but it never became part of international law in relation to communication systems. So there's a long history here, a long history that suggests that whenever we are met or confronted by the invention of a new system of long-distance communication, whether it's for media or interpersonal communication, we enter a period during which we try to work over the social rules, the political rules, the legal environment, the etiquette by which these new technologies will be taken up and used in formal and in informal environments. When the telephone was invented and came into the American home in the 19th century, people worried, wealthy people in particular, worried that they couldn't determine the identity properly of the person on the other end of the phone. And they became concerned that they were talking to not just strangers, but to people who were misidentifying themselves and their purpose. Sounds familiar? It should. So we've been here before. And that's not to say, of course, that we know everything we need to know because of the past. We don't. Each new medium of communication establishes its own context. And another way of saying it might be each new medium of communication destabilizes the old contexts and the old social habits that we have built up over time for how to conduct our business with others. And I think what Josh and Rita will do today is help us to move forward in the conversation that we still have to have about the rules for these underground battlefields, these new and strange, anxiety-provoking spaces that anew require us to think about the balance between the freedom to correspond, the freedom to communicate across borders, and the safety of the state, a problem that first appeared with the telegraph in 1870, and a problem that we still have to grapple with today. So, Rita, Josh, I think you have some material for us to take a look at.
I think that's the best introduction that we've ever had to this project, hands down.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was
Let's
really,
on
really
with
fantastic.
the show.
So we have some images. Because this new medium of communication is one that is visually rich and is visually new to many people. We have some slides and then a short documentary that we're going to show that recaps our ethnography, if you will. So Rita, why don't you begin? I think it's probably easiest for us to cue Diego on the slides if we can actually see them, so we'll have to join you in the audience.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you Ted and Damien and Aspen Institute and the Niemeyer Center for having us. And first I just want to introduce Dancing Ink Productions and let you know how we got to this place, because I know there's often a lot of perception that technology can or is intended to replace human interactions. And in founding Dancing Ink Productions, the intention was to bring people closer together and to really do to bring people closer in the physical world. So I just want to quickly tell you how we got to this point so that it makes sense in context. So in 1999, a friend of mine who was a war journalist showed me a roll of film of a person from Kosovo who was dressed and had a fire on the end of his shirt. And then as you look through the roll of film, the fire got bigger and bigger and bigger until you're looking at a charred skeleton. And at the end of this roll of film, I decided that I would become a journalist. And literally at that moment, I saw a book called The Journey is the Destination. Many of you may have seen this. It's a posthumous publication. Kathy Eldon published it. Her son Dan was a 22-year-old Reuters photographer who was stoned to death in Somalia in 1993 with 3 other journalists. And it really struck me the danger of connecting people. It's not, but when there are extremely difficult cultural issues to overcome. Right away, by a freakish coincidence, the then editor of the Village Voice, Don Forst, tracked me down through the internet. He had read a column that I wrote, and he called, and I said, well, I have you on the phone. How do I pitch an article to the Village Voice? And he said, well, you have me on the phone. What's your article? And I thought, okay. So my first job out of college, I had been driving from New York to California. My car broke down across the Deep South. I ended up in Albuquerque, and I decided to stay because I heard that America Online was opening a call center, and I had not used the internet at all in college because I was an old-fashioned writer. I used a typewriter, and I wrote longhand. And so I figured it was 1996. I should really learn how to use the internet. So I spent a very brief stint at America Online, but I was a vulgarity censor monitoring screen names and profiles. And so the article that I wrote for the Village Voice was called Terms of Service, Sweaty Scenes from the Life of an AOL Censor. And I looked at context of digital anonymity. And because of the popularity of this article, it plummeted me to a position, ascended me, I'm sorry, jet lag is setting in, put me in a position of being an expert, if you will, on digital anonymity, which is something that not that many people at the time really thought that much about. And so a few years passed. I worked as a journalist. I documented post-Katrina corporate profiteering. I was a reporter on the nuclear industry, the relationships between corporations and governments. And after my report on post-Katrina profiteering was published, I was exhausted. It was very widely covered internationally. And a friend of mine who worked at IBM over lunch one day, this is in November 2006, said, you know, you should try investigating something more fun. And I thought, yeah, that would be great. And he said, why don't you try Second Life? And I'd never heard of Second Life before. I had absolutely no idea what it was, and he started describing it, and he didn't say that it was a virtual world. He said, it's an amazing place where you can create your own identity, and you can create a community of like-minded individuals. You can live in a beach house. I said, yeah, I want that. So I raced home after lunch and Googled Second Life, and they ask you to create an identity, and you create a name for yourself. And I signed up, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, and we will show you images, but just a lot of people often have never heard of Second Life, and so we just wanted to preface it a bit with what it is. You get a generic avatar, which is a three-dimensional representation of yourself, and at the same time, there's people from all over the world signing in, and whatever their native languages are saying, oh my God, what is this place? I can't believe this, and it's in chat. And so the first person the person whose name he gave me was an IBMer. So this person, without this person, I don't know that I would have been really involved in the space because it was so unfamiliar to me. But things escalated. I was still in investigative mode. I ended up with 3 thick binders of information interviewing IBMers. So it was a Friday night around midnight, and the global director of IBM's three-dimensional internet effort got a hold of me in Second Life. Her avatar showed up at my house. And she said, what are you doing with this information? I said, I really don't know. Are you writing a book? I don't know. Magazine article? I don't know. I don't know, but it's very interesting. And so she said, where are you in the physical world? And it turned out I was a mile away from her. I went in on Monday morning to meet with her, and she asked me to start a company and investigate IBM's work in virtual worlds. I thought it would be a one-off project, and people kept telling me, there's one other person in the world who does what you do in this space. So the two of us, Josh and I, met in Second Life and started collaborating before we met in person. His avatar is a 7-foot-tall, green avatar with dreadlocks and goggles. Mine looks more or less like me, higher cheekbones, those sorts of things. But she's also about 6.5 feet tall, which I didn't realize until a while, but the other avatars are all tiny compared to me. But so we met and started collaborating, and we were interested in the intersection between culture and economy. It's our belief that these spaces, and I'll just leave you with one more thing, and then I'll turn over to Josh for a couple words. My first week in Second Life, in addition to interacting with IBMers, who, by the way, are working in separate continents on things like protein folding in virtual labs, really significant things that they're working on, I was reading a book by Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth. And so when I went into Second Life, people say it's filled with sex and depravity. Well, seek and ye shall find. If you go in and you search on sex and depravity, you will find it just as you will in the physical world. But if you go in and search on mosques, temples, synagogues, cathedrals, you will also find a lot of spiritual activity taking place in the spaces. And so I went to a virtual synagogue, and I met a Muslim woman in a virtual synagogue and started interviewing her. And she told me that she had been curious, burning with curiosity her entire life about what goes on during prayer services in a synagogue, but felt that she would be persecuted or make people uncomfortable if she showed up in the physical world in a synagogue. And now she felt that she had a much greater understanding of what went on during prayer services. And so that's the history of what leads us to this moment, which is that these are real people in these spaces. There's an entire demographic of people who are really excited that they can be vampires now, and that's great. We're not judging, we're not condemning or condoning, but that is not our demographic. Our demographic is people like us gathered here today, and people who are not here today who are interested in the evolution of human consciousness. And there are conferences taking place in these spaces examining the future of religion, spirituality, secular thought, mixing with spiritual thought. And so we are taking this from a position that these are serious people with real world identities who are interacting in this space in the form of avatars.
I'll just give you a tiny bit of background that's not included in my bio, which is that in 1991, I would say my entire life has been defined by one passion, and that is a dedication toward cultural relations and improving cultural relations on a global scale. In 1991, I had a bit of an epiphany. I was in graduate school, and a friend of mine introduced me to this thing called the internet. And at the time, this predates the World Wide Web. It predates browsers. It predates any of the gadgets that we are so accustomed to. What he introduced me to is this thing called IRC chat, which was a text-based, real-time interface. There were no graphics. It was just text. It was January of 1991. As some of you may recall, that was around the time that it actually was the beginning of the first Gulf War. And I started chatting with whoever was online. And the first people I discovered happened to be some graduate students in Tel Aviv. And it happened to be right when Scud bombs were landing in Tel Aviv. And my epiphany at that moment was that the internet was going to radically transform the way that cultures encountered each other, the way that we learned about who we are and how we're different and how we come to understand each other. And it was that point that I dedicated my career toward getting into the cultural relations work. And I directed myself toward working at the U.S. Information Agency. We have a former ambassador from that here. And that was where my first job was out of graduate school. And I rolled up my shirt sleeves, and I was really excited to get to be involved with using new technologies to engage new cultures. And the first thing I found out when I arrived at USIA was that email was forbidden. It was considered to be an unsafe means of interacting with cultures. We weren't. And so, but as things evolved, government did relax a bit. But it's been a constant challenge to bring the awareness of the power that some of these technologies provide to the people who are really on the front lines of doing cultural relations work. And so really the theme that goes through the years since that has been trying to explore how these new technologies can really illuminate new opportunities for people in different cultures to come together to understand each other. And that's really what the story is about. And I'm going to let Rita launch us into that.
And we did travel through 4 continents in the physical world while we were working on this project, and to really come to understand the kaleidoscopic practice of Islam and understanding of Islam around the world, and perceptions of non-Muslims toward Islam. But the really interesting thing, and then we'll start the slides and the presentation, is because there is anonymity in these spaces, which is the root cause of fear, it's also the root cause of candor. And people say, well, how do you know that someone's really what they say they are? That does not necessarily matter as much as listening to what it is that people are saying. And so the core concept that we really focus on is when you have a system of values, and we hear this a lot at this conference and every conference that we go to on these issues, to respect other people's values. But what are values? Very often values are inherited, and people practice them out of a sense sometimes of obligation and not necessarily an authentic desire to manifest something that they've learned. So understanding the balance between the individual's perceptions of their values that are inherited and the ability to create communities that allow people to express a more nuanced perspective than are permitted often in the communities that they live in, is creating a new global culture. And so when we hear people say that the digital culture is somehow dehumanizing people or it's not valid, we consider ourselves to be members of that culture, and it's no different than if someone were to stand up and say, we don't consider the culture of New York to be a valid culture. I mean, there are millions of people, hundreds of millions of people around the world. Last count, 300 million people who belong to virtual worlds of some kind. And so that's a lot of people to consider it an invalid culture. And so there's a simultaneity about it where you do live in the physical world, but we also have, when you say hearts and minds, those things are harder to understand than a physical body in a physical place. And so there's a duality there, and there's a nuance to that. That's what we're trying to get to in this work. So we understand that it can be off-putting to see avatars. What are they? Who are they? But so just bear with us as we go through the presentation, and just suspend your disbelief and realize that these are real people in these spaces. So thank you. So we like to start off with this quote, this Wallace Stevens quote. The subject matter is not that collection of solid, static objects extended in space, but the life that is lived in the scene that it composes. And so reality is not that external scene, but the life that is lived in it. Reality is things as they are. Okay? This is just, okay.
So the next couple slides are really to illustrate why you should care. I think there's a perception that in addition to the substantive cultural stuff we're going to illustrate, the raw numbers alone are pointing to a dramatic change in virtual worlds. So this slide basically is following the arc of the number of virtual worlds that are extant and where they're predicting that they're going to go. So we already have in 2009 approximately 150 different virtual worlds out in the marketplace that are free and for various different age groups. So we'll go to the next slide quickly. This is the number of registered accounts. So we have over 300. We're predicting many, many more than that as the years go up. And this shows how many people, the arc of registered users. So you have we have right now over 600 million registered users. That's okay to go to the next slide. And this shows the whole, right, so it's actually, it's actually doubled in the last couple of months. So the rate at which people are entering into these spaces is exponential. And part of it is because they're cutting across generations. And that's really what this slide illustrates. This is kind of complicated, but this is considered the virtual world universe. And what it does is, starting at the top of this arc is the ages. So age 5 to 8, age 8 to 10. And what you get is in each section, each pie, you get it's the number of virtual worlds targeted at that age group. So the densest number of virtual worlds are actually between age 8 and 13, but they go all the way around to 30 plus. So this is basically all of the 300 or so virtual worlds that are extant today. In the center is when they first launched, and you can see that a couple dozen of them have been around since before 2005. So not only is it, so what's happening really is that while there are 300 out there, you have an entire generation that is being raised, immersed in these things. And why that's important to this conversation is that 5, 10, 15 years from now, these are the people who are going to be entering into the workforce. Many of them already are in the workforce. There's a fluency that they will have, a familiarity with interacting with people in these kinds of spaces.
And to build off the last panel about storytelling, I'm always in it for the story. And so to me, this is really the ultimate story, because it allows people to share parts of themselves, from the first cave paintings until the latest piece of art created while we've been standing up here. There's an effort to become the protagonist at the center of your own story. And in these spaces, people are becoming unexpected community leaders, and they're able to share their stories as well as to preserve aspects of the past, as we'll show you in the slides, and to really do calculations with complicated mathematic algorithms about the future.
And this is another thing that's really important. One of the self-expression things that comes out in virtual worlds is that people create ways of expressing themselves through digital art, and they sell that art. And that art could be in the form of designing clothes. It could be in the form of creating paintings. It could be in the form of building mosques or houses. And in virtual worlds such as Second Life, which is the example that we're presenting today, anyone who makes anything in that virtual world owns the copyright. So I can, and thus I can determine whether I give it to your avatar or allow you to acquire it, and how much you'll pay for it. Now, and the point of this slide is to describe what the virtual world revenues are. In 2009, revenues across all virtual worlds for virtual goods sold are $3 billion. People are spending $3 billion. I'm paying people are paying me money in order to purchase my art, my creation. So there's a whole new form of digital art that's being created, and it's a fascinating exploration in terms of what is the definition of art and creation. Go ahead.
One of our major issues that we focus on is the evolution of the global workforce, too. And because work in virtual worlds is creative and meaningful and allows people to stay in their communities. And one of the issues that Cynthia raised on her panel last night, her excellent panel, was how do musicians make money? We see musicians in Second Life all the time having live concerts with global audiences and making, several $100s or sometimes up to, thousands of dollars just hanging out in their living rooms playing music with a global audience and people speaking in 10, 12, 15 languages at the same time. So it's pretty amazing. And it stems the out-migration of labor from a place. So for example, one of our areas of interest is in the Gulf Coast because of the out-migration of skilled labor. And so for the purposes of our panel here on security, peacekeeping requires a budget and technology can be expensive. And so one of our beliefs is that it becomes an economically viable venture to work on peacekeeping instead of creating and sustaining wars if, in fact, peacekeeping is expensive. So we believe that the same amount of, the budget and will has always existed for wars to be conducted in a very technologically sophisticated way, and we think it's time to philosophically start looking at peace as not the absence of conflict, but the productive channeling of conflict for greater creative meaning in society. This picture was taken, there was a protest in Second Life after in December 2008 during the violence in Gaza, and hundreds of people from all over the world, and particularly the region, gathered to have a protest. And so whenever there's a protest in Second Life, there have also been protests, for example, when the Burmese monks got into trouble with the police, hundreds of people gathered, and we interviewed them about how they perceive freedom. There were people from 25 different countries there. Similarly, you see that people would gather to express themselves in a nonviolent way. And I actually believe it's an ideal medium for conducting these conversations because violence and physical intimidation are completely impossible. So you can mute speakers, you can ban speakers from your area. There's instant translation, so we can speak to each other using voice or text and have that translated instantly so we can understand each other. And you can one of the things that we do is create environments for such discussions and events to take place in that are moderated for greatest impact and greater understanding.
One point I just want to mention, following on Sharon's, if we could go back to the previous slide. As you look at each of these slides, keep this in mind. Co-creation, which was a keyword that Sharon mentioned yesterday, every element that you see that's presented has been created by individuals like you and me. So what you see is an avatar, but the avatar has been co-created by artists who've gone into these spaces who like to design 3D faces or clothing. So it's that sign. Rita routinely makes art and paintings in these kinds of spaces. So there. And in fact, the next slide, if you will, actually shows that's a good example of that.
This is a Johari window, and Johari window is in 4 quadrants. How I see myself accurately, how I see myself inaccurately, how others see me accurately, and how others see me inaccurately. And the internet and immersion in virtual spaces is completely shaking up these quadrants in a way that interaction in the physical world makes it difficult. And I'll give you a brief example. And there's a slide about this later, so we don't have to jump ahead, but there's a virtual Hajj to Mecca that was created by a group called islamonline.net. And you go with a Muslim guide. It is not the same, and this is a really good example of where virtual event is not meant to replace a physical world event. It is meant to educate people about the symbolism of an event. So when we first went to check out the virtual Hajj to Mecca, we met two male avatars, one of whom was from the North Caucasus, and we were conversing in text. And I asked about ijtihad, the critical thought component of Islam. He thought I asked about jihad and got very upset and said, this is why we don't talk to Westerners, because as soon as we start talking, you want to know about jihad. And I said, go back through the chat log and read what I wrote. I actually didn't ask about jihad, and he was quiet for a couple minutes, and Josh and I were like, God, what's going to happen? And at any point when you're uncomfortable, you can teleport out of a space. That's the other thing, or turn your computer off. You're not in a space with someone who's flaming mad at you, or vice versa. But we decided to stick it out and wait, and a couple minutes later, he texted in and said, okay, I see that I was wrong, I apologize, and I apologized to him for underestimating the language barrier. And then we had the most interesting conversation, really one of the most interesting conversations of the project for about an hour and a half. Now, try to picture in the physical world going up to someone and, oh, I want to know about the critical thought component. You know, it's just, you don't just march up to someone in the street because you see an opportunity to ask a culturally sensitive question. And so many of these questions go unasked and unanswered because of the barriers between us.
Or a Western, a non-Muslim woman going to the outskirts of Mecca and engaging in this kind of,
in a way that can be
it would never have been replicable in the physical world.
And I will add about that when you go to the virtual Hajj to Mecca, there's a duffel bag that you can click on that gives you everything you need to participate in an authentic way, and I say authentic in a symbolic way, including the proper attire and even animations for stone throwing, information about what each step of the journey means. And it's called resing in Second Life. So if I wanted to res a coffee cup right now, it means to make something appear. So there's a whole, I'll spare you the technological details, but you can make something appear. So when you click on the duffel bag, but it doesn't always work, is the point I'm trying to make. And so I was trying to res my headscarf as a gesture of respect to take the Hajj to Mecca in Second Life, and it would not appear. So not only was I asking questions, but I was doing so with my avatar without any manifestation of respecting the fact that I've been given these tools to participate meaningfully. This is a woman that we met they bring Muslim clerics into Second Life, and we attended some really interesting sessions with American soldiers and Muslim clerics debating the violence, the war, religion, and if those discussions get to be too heated, again, they are moderated at so many different levels that it makes it more meaningful. So this woman was from Qatar. We actually kicked this project off at the U.S. Islamic World Forum in Doha, Qatar. And so we met quite a few people. We interviewed people from 25 different countries, I think, in Second Life. And so this is one of the women that we met at this event with a Muslim cleric. And these are actual, we did a graphic novel to go along with the project. And these are actual transcripts from the interviews that we did and the people, screenshots from the people that we interviewed in the space. So this is also a picture from the protests after the violence in Gaza heated up, I guess. And we interviewed this avatar about why he chose to set fire to himself in the space. And he said that he was burning with rage and sorrow about the escalating conflict on both sides. And he didn't know how to express himself in a way that was a healthy form of, I don't think he used the word healthy, but a form of expression that was acceptable, socially acceptable. And so we see a lot of people in Second Life doing this sort of thing. And again, that's what we mean when we say people can tell their story and feel that they've been heard without resorting to, any sort of outward manifestation in the physical world that's disruptive to society. And I don't just mean violence, I mean any sort of anger that disrupts the flow of society. And this is a woman who, Josh and I attended an event in Second Life called The Future of Religions, Religions of the Future. And they brought in all sorts of scholars, and it was a really fascinating event. And this woman and her sister at the event said, you know, I think we're going to build a mosque. And so about a month later, Josh said, did you ever check back in with her and see if she built the mosque? And I said, yeah, let's see. So checked back in with her, and she said, oh yeah, we built it. We have hundreds of people from all over the world coming to it regularly. And so we went over to check it out. And it's their sim. A sim is a space in Second Life. And so this is the woman, and she owns it. So when you own the parcel, you control the level of dialogue. You can kick somebody out of the parcel, which is what you're looking at here. And they got into an argument about this. This is a man from Libya. She's from the UAE. And they were arguing about different manifestations of Islam, how they each perceived their religion socially. So he eventually did get the boot from the space, but not until we had about 8 pages of transcripts of them talking. So where else would this conversation occur? And this woman had told us that her family doesn't know she uses Second Life. She just closes the computer and puts it away at the end of the day. But she is running this mosque community, and she has hundreds of people who routinely come, and we attended a conversation about with people from 12 different countries who spontaneously gathered to discuss their regional laws regarding rape in Islam, how rapists are punished. And we thought, there's no moderator, this is going to escalate into, who knows? And it was the most civilized discussion, men, women, people from all over the world. So this is virtual ancient Mesopotamia. The Federation of American Scientists has taken real archaeological data that they've been gathering for years. So picture the Federation of American Scientists with drawers full of charred hearth, like this here, for example, these charred walls behind the hearths. They are virtually recreating ancient Mesopotamia, and it's a global effort. And so you can go into this space and even get costumes, and they take you on tours. But this is the landing portal, and this collaboration is one of these 5 areas that is a interdisciplinary, cross-platform effort to raise awareness about ancient Mesopotamia. And so when we were in the space, this woman's an archaeologist and works on the project, and she saw this rug, and she said, this textile is not an authentic textile to the period. And while we were chatting, she contacted the guy who put the rug there, because you can click on something and see who put it there and why they put it there, and told him, this is not an authentic representation. And they worked together to get an authentic textile sample, so the next time you go back into that temple, it'll be an authentic textile. So the level of collaboration in real time in these spaces is absolutely unbelievable. And the really interesting thing is, so some of these are avatars, and some of them are museum exhibits. So within the space, sometimes you'll walk up and you'll see, an avatar just standing there, and you kind of look and click on it, and it's a docent that will give you information as if he is a merchant from ancient Mesopotamia. So ancient Mesopotamia being present-day Iraq, where writing was invented there. So when most people think about Iraq, and you'll see in the little documentary that we shot in Second Life for the project, it raises awareness about the historical context of present-day Iraq, and it's pretty shocking, really. I mean, when we saw this, you see only little pieces of it here, but you can wander around this thing for miles, and they have recreated, ancient Mesopotamia. And I don't know about you, but when I was in 3rd grade, we did dioramas in shoeboxes, So, to take kids into virtual ancient Mesopotamia and say, this is what their community looked like, really is experiential in a way that neurologically your brain processes in 3 dimensions.
It's important to note on mentioning kids that the average age of Second Life users is actually 35, that it's 52% women. And one of the reasons why we chose this space for this project was because less than 25% of the registered users are from the United States. So you have an inherently global community that is there. And people there are language groups, there's a vibrant Brazilian community, there's a vibrant Arab community, there's a vibrant Japanese, Korean. You can go between language groups. We actually did another project exploring the journalistic potential of the space, because if you want to train a foreign correspondent and you don't have the funds to send them into different communities and cultures where different languages are spoken, you actually can get into communities in which people are not only speaking their language, but they actually emulate the nonverbal rules as well. One of the things that you see is in the United States, where our nonverbal rule is we keep a 3.5-foot distance between each other. In Brazil, 6 inches is the comfort zone for the physical space, and the avatars replicate that. They're real people behind the avatars, and they adhere to the social and cultural
it's fascinating.
customs.
And also, I will just add, in a cultural and economic way, one of the ways the space is used, for example, by IBM, is IBM has a difficult time motivating Chinese IBMers and Brazilian IBMers to work together on certain projects. Brazilians being, they don't want to do business with you till they see the whites of your eyes kind of thing. And this space is a sufficient, in fact, hugely motivates people to work together after they feel they've met in these spaces. And so we discovered people of all belief systems in the space, particularly the Abrahamic faiths, but any spirituality system that you can imagine, there is a community practicing in Second Life and sharing it with other people. But there's also something new that's happening, which is the synthesis of different systems of belief into one space. And so things like this, where you see this horse that is running past these statues, you can symbolically express ideas that simply cannot be manifest in the physical world. And so what you have for the first time in the history of humanity is an opportunity for people to imagine something together and then build it and then collaborate on the development of the project together. And so you could go to this today, and then tomorrow you can go back and someone has put a giant statue right in the middle of it, or someone else has scripted that statue with information, or, I mean, you can do anything you can imagine. And with music, with visuals, with any element that can be manifest in a three-dimensional space. And this is the Future of Religions, Religions of the Future event that we described earlier, which was attended by hundreds of people, speakers from all around the world, scholars, clerics, having really amazing discussions about the future of religion. And this is a huge movement that's going on the internet. One of the things we discovered is particularly, for example, second generation Turkish and Moroccan people in Amsterdam, when we were there doing interviews, one of the terms that we encountered, 2 terms that are memorable to us: intercreation, meaning that people working together to create a new way of functioning in a space, whether it be physical or virtual, or our belief is virtual translates back into the physical and vice versa, but also Googling their religion. Okay, so what you have on the internet is a mishmash of ideas that are not always really productive. And so when you have young people Googling their religion to see, because their beliefs clash maybe with those of their parents versus those of their community that they're being raised from birth in, they turn to the internet for information. And so because, as Josh pointed out, the average age of people in virtual worlds is very, very young, the way these spaces are developed is going to really be significant in the outcome of the representation of religion, spirituality, culture, and the economy.
And in fact, one of the people that Rita mentioned, a young Syrian woman who ended up building a mosque that now has hundreds of members with docents, really came into Second Life, as she explained to us, to explore and understand her identity as a Muslim. And this was a space that she felt was safe and creative and afforded her a great flexibility to sort of explore, because she was raised in a family in which she didn't actually, it wasn't a strictly religious family. She didn't have the same conservative clothing requirements, but wanted to better understand what was a more authentic manifestation of herself.
How it might feel and how people might perceive her, and then she actually shifted in the physical world. Time? Is that it? Oh, okay. Okay. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes to 2? Okay. So we probably don't have...
take some questions now and then...
Okay.
Sure.
Jonathan?
I just wanted to ask how traffic manages, if any, these kinds of experiences, and what if people try to disrupt them?
Excuse me, I can't understand.
Will you go to the microphone?
Yeah,
Sarah,
sure.
right behind you there?
We'll repeat it. He wants to know who moderates these experiences, if anybody, and monitors the traffic and that sort of thing.
And what happens if they're disrupted?
If someone is disruptive, you own your own space. So for example, if Dancing Inc. Productions has an event on our sim, we manage it. So whoever owns the space, because Second Life is user created, meaning that each parcel is owned by different groups. So if they have an event or a gathering of people, the owner of the parcel can kick someone off, or if you're in a conversation with me and I'm being offensive to you, you can just mute me and continue talking to everyone else, and you don't have to hear anything I say for the rest of the time. So it's pretty interesting in that way. It can be moderated. Yes?
I've never heard of this before, and my mind is boggling. I think it's fascinating, and perhaps I missed the beginning, so perhaps I missed it. To what extent is this being used in schools, and in fact, are there any institutions that are, do you foresee, or is it actually happening, institutions that are building their entire educational methodology around this? Because as you said, rather than reading a book on Mesopotamia and taking some notes to just go in there, I mean, I can just imagine whatever the subject may be to, be delivered that way.
Yeah, in fact, there are, I think, 500 schools and universities right now in Second Life, and they're doing incredible things. I don't know if any institution has created their entire program around it yet, but I think, I'll give you one brief example. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has created an underwater environment because one of their missions is to raise awareness about ocean safety. You can swim in the ocean from the poles to the equator, and you can see all the wildlife, and you can press a button and see what 100 years of global warming would do to the environment instantly. So you can take one environment, let's say it's a forest, you can take kindergartners into it and say there's a deer, and they're, oh, okay. Or you can take grad students in and say, okay, however many feet under the surface is an ore of some kind that you're going to mine, and they can mine the surface. So you can create one educational atmosphere that is age appropriate. It's then up to the teacher to be a content director.
We have a question over there, too.
Yes, I want to link this conversation to the conversation that happened at the Paris Forum last year. I don't know how many people are here.
She wants to link the conversation to a conversation at the Paris Forum last year.
Yes, I'm not sure how many people are here who were at the first discussion last year, but I came to this discussion today expecting to hear something about the threats that are faced by the use of internet. So I totally get the point that that's not the only possibility with the internet, but I'm also a little bit struck that this panel hasn't really reflected on the possible relationship between the virtual discussion and how that might be impacting positively or negatively in the physical world. So for example, the guy who is self-immolating as an avatar, what is he doing the day afterwards? Okay, so maybe he's expressed his rage and he goes off and he's living his life as some very self-contained citizen, but is there another way in which that is manifesting in ways that, I don't know if you've looked at that, if there's a relationship?
Well, right now, because so many people have not even really ever heard of these spaces, we're raising awareness about the fact that so much activity is taking place in these spaces, and the fact of the matter is the military has a very large presence in these spaces. There's a lot of studies that are happening about the relationship between virtual, and we're happy to talk to anybody about that afterward as well, but because these spaces are so new to people, it's hard to just jump in and then launch into that without laying out the philosophical groundwork of what the space is and how people are using it.
I mean, there are a lot of key. There are two elements to national security that I think are critical to consider. One is and this is why we say peacekeeping needs a budget. I think the people who are on the front lines of cultural relations are actually working toward greater national security. That is, I think, a far undervalued, underappreciated, critical part of national security. To your specific point, I think about whether about what kind of activities are going on that are questionable. We encountered, and actually these weren't included in our final policy recommendations or report, but we're happy to discuss it. Elements of both Islamist and Western non-religious extremism, political extremism. We found propagandists who were working for various U.S. contractors. We can go into those as well, but suffice it to say that there is a definite cultural battleground going on. There are people. This is one of the reasons that we were so concerned about bringing this to the attention of people who are in the cultural relations business, is because they aren't there. The people who are working for organizations that are attempting to create counter narratives, if you will, are very actively participating in these spaces, and we have extensive interviews with those people. But on the other hand, the positive opportunities that are really augmenting exchange programs, if you will, that are creating nexus points for humans to come together and better understand each other. I think those are the most important things that we encountered, and the things that can ultimately lead to better relations in the physical world. So they're the things that extend into and can be continued into the physical world.
Let me add just something quickly to that and to your question as well as backdrop. These spaces may seem strange, somewhat invisible to some of us, but oddly, from a security point of view, they are the most visible. They are the easiest to monitor, the easiest to track, the easiest to survey, the easiest to enter. In this sense, that the military, the security community, as is displayed in many Hollywood movies, rightly in this case, is way ahead of you and way ahead of us. It's the physical world where security issues really are a dilemma for those in the classic security business. But virtually everything, actually everything that happens in the virtual world is known or potentially knowable because of the digital tracing. And that's, I think, so we could do a different panel on how digital security experts monitor this world. Suffice it to say, they do an exceptionally good job of it. They do a better job in this environment than they do in the physical world, because it's actually easier to hide in the physical world. And any security expert, I think, would agree with that statement. And so that I think is a critical first point to make. And the second point to make, and it was also a question I think that emerged at the end of the last panel, is the question of responsibility, social responsibility, if you will. Broadly speaking, I mean, what is the responsibility of people who create and then live in or semi-dwell in a space like Second Life to broader social questions that have to do with security, safety, morals, order, etc.? And I think the answer is that the responsibility is a real issue, but it's not the only issue. And you can't trump a communication environment by saying, but someone will use this to do something wrong. That was also true with writing systems. I mean, writing systems were a real risk. They were a risk to people in control because it allowed people to express their thoughts privately and pass them on to others and pass them on to other generations in a storable manner. Every communication system that allows me to speak with a stranger, whether it's a stranger to me now here or nearby or far away, it is potentially a risk to the prevailing norms, mores, laws, political order of things. And as it were, we're in a business of permitting or being permissive around that kind of risk-taking, and then making sure that we don't go over the line. Yeah.
Just bouncing off of what you were asking, I think, for us, I mean, for myself, I should speak only for myself, I'm very interested in knowing more about the translation between what happens there and what happens in reality. So for instance, and I don't know, maybe these studies are just happening, that it's too new to have a lot of them. For instance, you're talking about cultural exchanges, which we're here to talk about. What goes on there as to how it actually helps translate into the reality of cultural exchanges? That's, I think, the link that's missing for me that I would like to, going forward, learn more about.
Maybe I could answer that quickly. As a former exchange student, I think that when I was 16, I was an exchange student in Brazil. It completely transformed radically how my career was from that point on. It's going to deal with that. But if you look in raw numbers, again, at how exchange programs are funded across the various countries that actually fund these kinds of things, the exchange programs, while the U.S. budget is something like $300 million a year, the U.S. only spends relative to, say, France or other countries significantly less in exchange, so we don't need to go into those details. But the visits are generally for a week or a couple weeks or a year. What goes on in virtual spaces, because they're 3D and they're immersive, they actually are the closest approximation to a physical world interaction that we've found so far. And that's why we think it's so important, because what happens when the person goes back to their country? How do you maintain those relationships in a way that's substantive? Facebook, MySpace, asynchronous things like Twitter, email? Not necessarily. I don't think that relationships are maintained. So part of it, and we illustrate this in our documentary a bit as well, is that we don't have time to show up. We can show you later. It's on the web as well. But there's a real depth that comes out of the kinds of interactions. And because it's three-dimensional, the human brain is really, we're hardwired for three-dimensional interaction.
And there is neurological research to support the fact that your brain files these three-dimensional experiences in the same place that it does physical world experiences, which is another.
You can find it on our website, which is dancingincproductions.com.
We're going to take one more question, and my apologies to the others who might have wanted to ask a question, but it's over here. It's a gentleman who actually asked me to get up and take some questions. So you have the last word, and then we'll wrap up.
It's been a fascinating exposition about this project and about what can be done in virtual worlds. But for me, there are several questions. The first one, virtual worlds obviously respond to a need. There is a loss of the magical dimension of existence, so we recreate that in a different way. But this substitution of imagination by this virtual reality also raises, I think, a lot of questions. The first one is about real experience, and so our culture is basically about a real experience, a real human experience. The fact that you call this world Second Life means that what you do with the first one.
Well,
why don't you deal with the first one first?
I mean, we just study there.
And the second question, but these are questions that I would like to know.
Right.
So you're offering people to deal with their issues in a Second Life, in a different safe environment, let's say, or control. So that means they lose that basic experience about going through their fear in doing what they have to do. And I think that it's another question that the experience through your physical body and culture has to do with actually finding this connection between our mind and our body.
They're not mutually exclusive there.
No, I know, but there's also this element of eventually is an instrument of control. And how it's the fact that if you sort of intellectualize completely this process, then deal with all the other ethical issues that arise from it.
The ethical issues are really of primary importance to us. That's why we did this project with the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, so we could filter it through an ethics perspective. The numbers suggest that regardless of how we perceive the relationship between the physical world and the virtual world, hundreds of millions of young people particularly are as comfortable in these spaces. It's the same way young people can post pictures on Facebook, and we might say, oh my God, you're never going to get a job because you posted a picture of yourself in a bikini. They're like, well, whatever. I mean, so it's a generational perception as well. Now, I have my own feelings about that, and I don't disagree with a lot of what you're saying. But keep in mind that we studied what was already happening in the spaces. So not studying it is sort of, we didn't create this environment and invite people into it. We studied what was already happening. And in fact, this is a tiny fraction of what's happening in the spaces. And so also not everyone has the funds to travel. I mean, it's great if you can afford to travel, but what about the billions of people on the planet who the extent of their travel and interaction with other cultures might be virtual. It's not like everyone has the option of traveling. So it raises awareness in a different way. And again, I would just say the same way the virtual Hajj to Mecca is not the same as millions of people moving together through a space, connecting with God and each other. But it does, I didn't know about the Hajj before the same way. So it's not the same, but it's an experience.
So we have to wrap up, but I'm tempted to say that the one way to think about this is that if people were meant to see in middle and late middle age, they would have been born with eyeglasses. And we get used to certain technologies that help us get through what we call real life, the first life. And I think it's important to think along those lines when we start to think about a space like this. It is remarkable, it's new, it feels like an underground, it is. But the optical revolution that leads to us taking these for granted, and probably something even more fancy like a contact lens, is something I think we need to be mindful of as we think through this environment. Not naively, but think it through sort of cautiously and responsibly and respectfully to those people who use it as a place where they make meaning for themselves. DancingInkProductions.com is the site where you can go, right, where you can look at this project in detail and others. I believe we're adjourning to the main hotel for a working lunch, and we need to go now. So my thanks.
Thank you.